there's increasingly wide understanding about the consequences of the food system, how food is grown for the climate. People want to know, okay, was this food grown in a way that helped either reduce, the impacts on the climate, or potentially reverse and blunt some of the sharp edges of the climate? And that's what I think people are striving for.
Hey folks, welcome to a bonus episode of the Ecosystem Member podcast. Some of you are probably aware that Ecosystem Member is actually my second podcast project. My first, called You Can't Eat Money, looks specifically at the relationship between humans and nature and the more than human world through the medium of food. Given that our food system accounts for about a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, in particular incredibly potent methane, specifically from animal agriculture, and that many of us in the West eat a few meals a day, food seemed like a really good place to start, where individual action can actually make a really big difference. What you pick up off the grocery store shelf, what restaurants you frequent, and what you order at those restaurants shapes demand. If we opt for foodstuffs that are more environmentally responsible, that demand indicator can shape the purchasing and investment of sometimes really large businesses. The problem is there is a lot of misinformation out there. Just a couple weeks ago, a major study commissioned in the UK stated that beef cattle farming on the farm research was beyond net zero, meaning that the farm captures more carbon than it emits. The study, however, was quite small, only about 3 out of the 105 fields on the farm, which means it failed to meet the threshold for being statistically significant. What's probably not surprising is that the research was actually funded by McDonald's, which, according to reporting from Bloomberg, has a larger footprint of heat-trapping emissions than the entire country of Norway, the entirety of cement production in the United States, and American Airlines. It has been estimated that McDonald's sells about 2.36 billion hamburgers per year globally. Many people who have shared the McDonald's-funded research online have used the phrase, "it's not the cow, it's the how," which, to put it bluntly, is ridiculous framing that insinuates that the other side is actually blaming cows for climate change. As Andy Jarvis, the director of Future of Food at the Bezos Earth Fund, told me in a recent LinkedIn exchange, the cow that exists for animal agriculture today has been so manipulated by humans that it no longer resembles the cows that were first domesticated. So, in light of its recent James Beard Foundation Award nomination, I'm re-releasing the episode I recorded for You Can't Eat Money with the author of The Blue Plate, Mark J. Easter. I've read far too many books and white papers on this topic, but Mark's research, insight, and empathy makes The Blue Plate the only book that I really recommend to people when it comes to understanding the impact on nature and the more than human world, and really the impact on ourselves of our food system. So huge congrats to Mark on his nomination. I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I did when I recorded it. If you enjoy this episode, please make sure to leave a rating on your favorite podcast platform for Ecosystem Member. Give us a thumbs up on YouTube if you're watching. You can get more Ecosystem Member by visiting ecosystemmember.com to subscribe to our Substack to get my episode posts as well as notes that I share on the site. We're going to be opening the aperture again when it comes to guests. So some of our upcoming episodes include a Zen teacher and author, a conceptual runner, and a really badass alpinist mother talking about parenting disaster style. Without further delay, here's the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member podcast with Mark J. Easter, author of the James Beard nominated book, The Blue Plate. Today on the You Can't Eat Money podcast, we are excited to welcome Mark J. Easter, ecologist and author of the new book, The Blue Plate, A Food Lover's Guide to Climate Chaos. Thanks for joining us today, Mark.
Hi, Rick. It's great to be here. Thank you for the kind invitation.
We are really excited to have you. Let's just sort of jump right into it. And there's one passage in the book that I dog-eared. It's fairly emotional. You kind of make the counter argument to everything else you've laid out in the rest of the book in a way. I'll just read out a little bit of it. So you write, at a time when we are told that time matters, when every little bit helps, when every single pound of methane avoided is a pound of cure, it feels like so much is being demanded of us when our leaders are making such poor choices about our future, and so little is being done in other sectors that increasingly matter. Why should I change what I eat or be bothered with how my food is produced, since relatively little seems to be done elsewhere. So now that the book is out in the world, what is your answer to that question? Like, why should people care? Why should people be bothered?
Yeah, that was an emotional moment for me and among many in writing the book. And what I was really acknowledging was, my own feelings and what other people were saying to me, what I was hearing from the community at large, also from farmers. The scientific community has been sounding the alarm about climate change for over 3 decades now, longer than that. And the media has really picked up the story finally, in the last decade or so. So there's been increasingly strident and alarming calls for action. And it's taken so long for the types of action we need to have happen at, federal and state governments, at institutional levels, within business, and all of these different aspects of it. Things are finally starting to happen. We're actually, as Katharine Hayhoe describes it, we're starting to bend the curve, which is a relief. It's exciting, even though it doesn't feel like it's enough at this point. But where I was really coming from with that was, food is one of the most personal things in any one of our lives. And we have such deep cultural and personal and family connections to it that go back generations. I know I'm still making recipes that come from my Dust Bowl grandparents and great-grandparents that carried forward down through the generations. And most of my family members are doing the same. All my friends are. These sorts of things, these sorts of stories appear when we sit down for meals with friends, with colleagues, or just with ourselves. And when we're confronted with those sorts of things, and we're asked the question, okay, geez, do I have to change this? Do I need to think about eating differently? Why should I do that when there's so much else that needs to be done? And it's something I've personally struggled with. It's one of these things where the head and the heart struggle with each other. And that's one of the things I just wanted to acknowledge in the book, that's part of the greater conversation that's going on here, culturally, at the national level, and also within our own minds. And so how has that landed? Yes, I have made some food choices. And it's where the heart is connected with the head, personally. And I'm starting to change the way that I eat. And I've found that I don't really feel like I'm giving anything up. It feels like my life is more enriched. There's so much to feel inadequate about when it comes to, the climate crisis. Whether it's, how we travel, how we get around, whether we take vacations or not. Do we do a staycation versus, flying overseas to Europe? The last thing I think anyone wants to feel inadequate about is food. And so I hope that this contributes to that conversation and helps relieve some of that anxiety and offers people opportunities to make choices that they can feel good about, that change the backstory of the food that's on their plates.
I want to dig into that last part you just talked about here. Kind of like in the direction that you're saying, most people don't just stock their fridge with Soylent and call it a day. Even if they don't call themselves a foodie or have a deep love of food or have a garden in their backyard, like people do often really have a connection to their food choices in a number of different ways. And with all of that you just talked about, and you're coming to write this book, which has a lot of science and data and sort of verification in it of the things that you're proposing, but you also talk to a lot of people directly who are involved in the production of food, but also, you're thinking about it as an eater, the consumption of food. So the science kind of gives us an idea that the actions, or at least the direction of the actions, are clear, but there's a lot of culture attached to food. So how do you, and this is sort of a personal question because hosting this podcast, I've always really struggled with, I don't want to necessarily be prescriptive to people because food choices, as you said, are so personal, but I do want to present them with the information that I'm coming across. So how did you try to thread that needle with this book?
Yeah, I so appreciate that question. Really, what was involved there was just listening to people, but also listening to myself and paying attention to myself. I sort of joke in the book that there's a special place in hell for greenhouse gas accountants who offer bullshit rationalizations. In the end, I just really felt like I had to be honest with myself and honest with the larger community that I'd been in conversation with for over 3 decades about these sorts of things. There's so much involved here. The types of choices we make about food, besides being deeply personal, oftentimes it's just simply made out of convenience. And there's a lot of people on the planet who just don't have that many choices, whether you live in a food desert or there's situations involving their life. They might be working 2 or even 3 jobs. They have kids. They're trying to make ends meet, get the kids to school and back, deal with all the other complications. And they may not have either the resources or the time or both of those to sit down and be as thoughtful about the food choices, the ingredients, and either preparing or going out and buying the food, at a restaurant or fast food joint. And so just trying to acknowledge that those are realities that are out there, being honest with basically everybody who is facing these sorts of situations and myself is really what helped contribute to that conversation.
It's a really interesting point that you make there. It's sort of a privilege to be able to care about food as much as you or I do.
Exactly, it is. And in the short term, what we want our foods to be labeled and to know where they're coming from. We want to know what the backstory for food is, whether it's if you're buying coffee, if it's bird friendly or rainforest friendly, say for example, or if you're buying a head of lettuce, is it organic or conventional? Or now regenerative. But ultimately, what I think we all want is for that question to be settled before the food even goes into our grocery basket, or comes to our plate in a restaurant, or we're at the farmer's market and we pull it off the table and put it into our, hand over some money and put it into our bag. We want to know that it was grown in a way that's sustainable and that ensures, the long-term future of humans on the planet and all the other creatures that we depend upon. Hopefully, the book is a contribution towards that long-term goal. It is a privilege for us to be able to make those sorts of choices, and at the present time, buying regeneratively grown foods tends to be more expensive. Hopefully, that will level out and it will become the norm as opposed to just the exception.
I read a piece of journalism, I think it was from The Guardian, when I was living in the UK, that somebody went into a Sainsbury's, a large Sainsbury's grocery store, like a Kroger or Albertsons here in the US. And, these large grocery stores have tens of thousands of products on the shelf, and that's just the packaged stuff. That's not including all of the nice, fresh stuff that's on the outside where, Michael Pollan's like, just circle the exterior of the grocery store, don't go into the middle. But when they went into the middle on all these packaged products, you just mentioned labels, they found something like 400 plus labels on these products of everything from, organic to bird friendly, as you mentioned, and now regenerative, which, you and I look at these and say, these are great indicators of progress in the food industry in terms of how our food is being produced in a number of different benefits for a number of different areas. As an average food consumer, is it kind of impossible for people to make these choices? What direction would you give to someone who's going into the grocery store and trying to decipher these hundreds of labels?
Yeah. I read that story too, and I had exactly the same response. I think what this indicates is that there's so much interest from consumers around food, and people are demanding a lot. We want our food to be grown sustainably. We don't want to feel guilt or worry about the health or the sustainability of food item that's on our plate. We want to, when we make that morning cup of coffee, we want to know that it was grown in a way that it didn't harm birds in whether it was Brazil or Ethiopia or Indonesia or whatever part of the world it might have come from. There's increasingly wide understanding about the consequences of the food system, how food is grown for the climate. People want to know, okay, was this food grown in a way that helped either reduce, the impacts on the climate or potentially reverse and blunt some of the sharp edges of the climate? And that's what I think people are striving for. And it increases our appetite for good things when we know that there's a positive or a more positive story behind what it is we're picking up and what goes into the skillet, before we serve it at our table.
And I want to dig into one of those terms we just talked about, regenerative. So we've had on the podcast before Paul Lightfoot, who I think is still the board chair of Regenerative Organic Alliance, which has the Regenerative Organic certification. We've also talked to David Bronner, who I think is also on the board, who's been pushing for that. There's a lot of conversation around regenerative. And there was a little bit of pushback. You mentioned some of the concepts and sort of practices in the Blue Plate, and it's definitely worth folks that are interested in digging into that, dig into the book, because I think you present it in a really balanced way. But there's been some pushback recently, I think, from the scientific community, or at least parts of it. And I sent you some of these articles. There's an article in NPR sort of questioning regenerative grazing. Jonathan Foley, who's the executive director of Project Drawdown, highly respected, also sort of called it into question. And a lot of it seems to be, I think when we talk about this cultural attachment to food, people's cultural attachment to meat is incredibly strong. Even though I love tomatoes, I don't know anyone else whose cultural attachment is as strong to tomatoes as it might be to meat, for example. And I think there's been, one side of the argument that says it's the how, not the cow, or something like that. It's about how we raise the cow, not necessarily the cow in and of itself. And there's a lot of other folks like George Monbiot, who's going in the other direction and saying there's actually no sustainable way to do this. From my read of the Blue Plate, it seems pretty clear that you're suggesting that we probably need to reduce our meat production and consumption. Just the pure amount that we're creating, plus it looks like the planet's population is only going to continue to increase, which as countries get wealthier, they increase their meat consumption. So it looks like we probably need to figure out a way to produce less and eat less. And I think importantly, you point out that there's no viable agricultural sink for methane the same way there is for carbon. And you've kind of raised that the science isn't necessarily showing that it can be a complete sink, completely sort of offset the effect of the methane from the livestock. So there's very much parts of regenerative agriculture that are working, as you share in the book. Cover cropping, no-till, those sort of things. When it comes to the animal and regenerative grazing, how do these two things fit together? Is the animal sort of necessary to a lot of regenerative organic? I think there was one farmer you talked about who said he couldn't actually go organic without having the animal in the field to practice it and reduce the need for fertilizer. So in this controversy of regenerative grazing as a subset of regenerative agriculture, is regenerative grazing necessary? Is it as effective as people claim? Where does your research net out? Where did you find from your conversations that the situation actually lies, where the conclusion actually lies?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most interesting parts of the conversation that's going on right now. Do we have to stop eating meat? Do we need to eat less meat? What's the role of livestock in all of this in regenerative agriculture? And I think it's important to step back and look at a couple of key concepts. The first is, I don't think we can look at it as a black and white issue, as it's either one or the other. The science seems to be pretty clear that we can't necessarily eliminate or completely offset the greenhouse gas emissions produced by fossil fuel just by the way we change the way we grow food, whether that's raising crops or grazing livestock. But this is the key point I try to make in the book. We still need to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's necessary. It's basically mandatory, is what the scientific community has been saying for more than a decade now. And one of the most cost-effective ways to do that is with agriculture. It's on the order of tens of dollars per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent compared with the other technological fixes, the synthetic photosynthesis that's being developed, and other ways, carbon capture technologies that are physical and engineered as opposed to biological. And these sorts of methods, they're really necessary in order to, I describe it as blunting the sharp edge of the climate crisis, help keep us from warming the climate into extreme, dangerous levels. And there's so many other aspects of that too, though. Now, this is where I think the scientific community, there's a very healthy and really important dialogue that's going on within the scientific community around this. And how far can we go with that? And that's still somewhat in question. But where the science seems to be landing is that we could currently offset somewhere between like about 15% and about a third of our fossil fuel emissions if we went all in across the board. And that's every country, every continent, every farmer. That's sort of like the technical feasibility of it. It's probably not likely that that's going to happen, but any farmer, any field, any country that makes a serious effort in this space is going to help not just reduce emissions, but help draw down carbon to some extent. The other thing that we find is that regenerative agriculture is essentially a no-regret strategy. There are so many other benefits that come with it. And when farmers are able to find the capital and the technical expertise and the peer support to actually engage in it, it's really unusual that they go back to conventional methods because they see so many other benefits, from capturing and holding rainwater and snow melt to easing the ups and downs in their yields, they study the yields, helping them weather droughts, helping them weather extreme storm events. And also, ultimately, once they get the practices down, reducing their costs and sustaining, or in a lot of cases, increasing their yields. And so it's a win-win-win strategy. It's what I consistently hear from the growers I profile in the book and many others.
And I think that's really important. One of the themes that has come up in the You Can't Eat Money podcast often, whether I'm talking to chefs or other people in the food industry, is like, get to know your farmer. And that's a great thing to say if you're a chef and you're sourcing food from them every single day and they're delivering it, and you're ordering special things and they're doing things on your behalf to make sure you can create the menu that you want to create. For the average eater, it's more like, a CSA. You profile a great one in Fort Collins in your book, which sounds awesome. I'd actually I want to figure out a way to come and visit it because it sounds like really cool. Also, the jalapeno basil lemonade sounds delicious. So I definitely want to check that out. But for the rest of us, it's actually probably just going to our farmers market and having some conversations with the people behind the table about how they grow their tomatoes. So I think that's a great thing in the book, is that you talk to the growers, you talk to the producers, you also talk to people on the other end, the sort of the eaters. And you've got this central question in the book: can we eat our way out of the climate crisis? And you definitely have a lot of good guidance, I think, for eaters, but also people who are on the production end looking for examples and sort of people to hold up and see how that they're doing it. And you note that individual action is needed. So that would be, me buying some regenerative products from next time I go to the grocery store, wherever they're available. But that system change is also needed. And in the United States, another very controversial topic is the Farm Bill and things like farm subsidies. And I think the current one expires at the end of September. I know it changes and they kind of move things around and delay things, kick the can down the road, so to speak. But it looks like with Cory Booker involved now that he's going to push for some big changes. There's also been talks of things like a carbon tax. So if we think about the food system broadly, so we've talked about individual action, buying better, producers producing better, adopting some of these practices. But from a systems change, where's the leverage point? Do we need to fix the Farm Bill? Are there other things we could be doing? Is it a carbon tax? How do you see the system?
Yeah. Boy, there's so many interesting layers to that question. I think ultimately, the lesson that I've learned and many people that I know have learned is that if you go to wherever you get your food and you ask for things, if enough people ask for them, then they will respond, whether it's, as you mentioned, a grower at the farmer's market, or maybe it's at a restaurant, maybe it's at your local grocery store. And I have actually experienced it with my local grocer. I ask enough, and other people are asking enough. They start to make some changes in the products that they're making available to us. And it's so part of it is consumer demand, but also at the top level, federal and state agricultural policy do drive so much in terms of how crops are grown and what's made available. What I hear consistently from the farmers working in this space is that they really need a level playing field, and they don't currently have one right now. So much of the markets that they're able to sell into are driven by commodity programs and federal and state policy that drive commodity programs and essentially, for lack of a better term, dictate what actually can be sold. And a lot of that is related to demand that's coming out of a really small number of producers at the top level, not the farmers and the ranchers, but the people who are taking the raw materials, the corn, soybeans, lettuce, wheat, whatever it is, and turning that into food, packaged food that gets delivered to us. And so creating a level playing field and also acknowledging that all the difficulties, and also acknowledging that the costs of converting to a more sustainable system can't be borne simply by the farmers. It has to be that those costs have to be shared up and down the supply chain, and not just leveraged on consumers as well too, but there needs to be an acknowledgement for the manufacturers, the producers, the middlemen, the distributors, that there has to be an equitable arrangement here that allows these things to go forward, where we don't have the people at the two ends, the consumers and the farmers, on the pointy end of the spear in this process.
Yeah, those are all really good points. And you talk about sort of people demanding change. And I think this is a really interesting one, because we've had a lot of chefs on the podcast before, and they often, I think a couple of them, in fact, have brought up the example of how a chef in New York City making a kale salad in like the 90s all of a sudden catapulted kale into grocery stores around the country because people demanded it, and they found out about this new ingredient and they wanted to take advantage of it and start making their salads out of it. So talked a little bit about the system. For people on the individual level, yes, demand change, but like, do you think it has to come from, Top Chef having an episode of with only regeneratively grown ingredients? Do you think we need like people to have their local governments help connect them to CSAs the way that like we get connected with our energy or trash pickup or something like that? Like, for an individual to change, they kind of also have to know that it exists. So where, outside of hopefully reading your book, listening to this podcast, like where can we get to people on an individual level to convince them to like give this a shot? Like, where do you think the leverage points are there on this sort of the individual level?
Well, having a Top Chef regenerative show would be something like that would be fantastic, and telling those stories, increasingly telling those stories up and down the food chain, and having influencers like chefs, like writers, like restaurateurs. All of those sorts of things certainly help. Ultimately, having, increasing the conversation, continuing the dialogue, raising people's awareness, leads to the point where people start asking for things, not just at the restaurant or at the grocery store, but also asking things of our elected representatives. And but I think a larger thing, and I'll just summarize with this, is that we are so disconnected from our food. It's the food that we get in our grocery stores, and that's where the vast majority of us get our food, is grown typically more than 1,000 miles away, up to 1,300 miles away on average. We don't know, in most cases, who the farmer is or who the rancher was. We don't know who processed it. We don't know who shipped it. Those are essentially abstractions. We just go and we get a bag of weeds, which is what the people who grow lettuce describe, so many of these sort of salad clamshells and salad bags. We know nothing about where it came from. We just look to see, well, is this fresh? Is this appetizing? And can I afford it? And reestablishing those connections, which is critically important in reducing the supply chain so there's a tighter connection between grower and consumer, can only help in this case. And so that the stories become personal and we have the opportunity for asking for what we want directly.
And so to kind of bring our conversation to a close, there are these beautiful sentences in the book where you sort of zoom out and give us this bigger picture perspective that connects to these details. For example, you write that we can't really say agriculture is an unqualified success. You also note that without agriculture, the emissions that it's released, which warm the planet, we would likely be on our way to another glacial maximum. So these are like crazy things to think about in the world that we exist in today. So to kind of go back to some of the earlier questions, if we think about the future of our food systems, should we all be slurping Soylent or like hunting and foraging for wild game? I mean, these are some of the extremes that exist on this. Like, there's a blueprint in the book, I think, that's a fairly realistic way for an average person to operate in our current system, especially in certain places in the West where they do have access to CSAs and regenerative ingredients. Maybe not everywhere. We've acknowledged that, but sort of in your blue sky thinking, summary of what you've learned. Like, what does a climate positive future food system look like?
Yeah, so from the perspective of the consumer, I think Michael Pollan summed it up beautifully in his book, In Defense of Food. He wrote, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. I've taken that advice to heart, and that's the direction that I'm going, and so many people I know are going, and there's a larger community around that. For meat eaters, there is, including myself, there are good low-carbon alternatives that are out there. One of them that fascinates me is farmed shellfish, mussels, oysters, clams, scallops. They're essentially fixing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in their shells, turning CO2 into rock. And they're also super positive in terms of cleaning up estuaries and the water and coastlines. And so there's other opportunities like pastured poultry as an alternative to red meat. Shortening the supply chain, eating food that doesn't travel by air, and trying to buy food from your local food shed, either at a farmer's market or asking your grocers to buy from local growers, shortening those supply chains. But one of the most interesting things, I think, is composting. And I know that gets a lot of attention, but diverting your food waste and your yard waste from the landfill and into a composting program where it can become a soil amendment for regional farmers and ranchers to use. There's so many positives to that. And just by keeping the food out of the landfill, you're preventing emissions. Just the same way if you decide not to drive your car for an errand, either to carpool or ride your bike or walk, or to just wait and consolidate that trip into several others. There's so many positives associated with that. And so hopefully that's a helpful blueprint for the typical consumer going forward. And I know it's something that's enriched my own life.
Fantastic. And you mentioned shellfish there. You have a great story talking to Terry Sawyer of Hog Island in the book, which we had John Finger, the other founder of Hog Island, on our podcast before. So pick up the blue plate, hear from Terry, listen to the podcast, hear from John. But speaking of culture, like my family in California, Tamales Bay is definitely a cultural fixture for my family. So I wholeheartedly endorse the endorsement of shellfish, and definitely pick up the book to read more about why they're fantastic in addition to what Mark just mentioned. But thank you so much, Mark, for joining us on the podcast today. I think this is such a great primer for anyone who hopefully is keen to pick up the book. We'll be able to dig deeper in all these topics and learn even more. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Rick. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you here.